We are delighted to have Professor Inaga Shigemi with us today, who will be presenting his lecture, Casting Shadows and Triggering Resonances, Japanese Modern Artists in Paris, the circular spiral model of artistic exchanges between Asia and Euro-America. In his lecture, Professor Inaga will explore the fascinating intersections between Japanese and Western artistic traditions, shedding light on how these cultural exchanges shape both the development of modern Japanese art and the Western reception of Japanese aesthetics. Professor Inaga Shigemi is a leading scholar in comparative literature, art history, and cultural studies. He completed his bachelor and master degrees at the University of Tokyo and his PhD at the University of Paris 7, which is 7, in 1988. Over the course of his career, he has held faculty positions at the University of Tokyo, Mie University, and served as Professor Emeritus at the International Research Center for Japanese Study in Kyoto. I think it says here, Nichibunken, is that correct? He also taught at the Kyoto Seika University between 2022 and 2025. Professor Inaga's research focuses on East-West cultural exchanges, modern Japanese art, and Japanism. His major publications include Le Crépuscule de la Peinture in 1997, which I think means Twilight of Painting, L'Orient de la Peinture, the Orient of Painting, and Images on the Edge from 2014. He has received numerous prestigious awards, including the Suntory Prize for Social Sciences and Humanities and the Watsuji Tetsuro Culture Award. Please join me in welcoming Professor Inaga Shigemi to stage, please. Professor.
Yeah, thanks very much for this very kind invitation, and also my thanks for this for my invitation to this prestigious exhibition. Can you hear me? Yes. And I, as a Japanese, as you know, Japanese begin by some apologies and excuses, and. Yeah, I have some throat problem and eyesight problem, and I'm a leftist, so I have some difficulties with manipulating. And anyway, and for the paper, for this reason, I'm not going to read my paper, but I try to simplify my phrases because my prepared text is too complicated. I found it. So afterward, if you wish to listen and to read very carefully the text, I try to make my draft accessible to you at your disposition. So I begin with my lecture. Of course, thanks Patrick Flores for your kind invitation, and Horikawa Lisa and all the team and the coordinators made every effort to make this possible. And as you know, this image is very got a popularity. And as you know, the painter Itakura Kanae died quite young in 1929, already at the age of 28. He was in Paris. And his wife, and here is the model, she returned home to Japan, but only 4 years later, in 1933, she also died. So they disappeared quite prematurely. And Itakura Sumiko, she got also unexpected popularity also in Paris because of this Honolulu series, and a very primitive one. And from these paintings, we can see how the Salon d'Automne or other salons in the 1920s were all about. And as for the husband paintings, for example, and this is an example, a very famous one, which we have discovered quite recently. That's in comparison with, for example, Odeon Rudon or Hasegawa Kiyoshi would explain the arrangement of flowers, and golden fish with the case of Animatis is quite evocative. And also the Odalisque series Animatis may be something to do with the choice of the posture of the model. And also the window series was very famous in Matisse, almost the same year. So it explains the reason why the husband chose that setting, as you see here. And of course, the human figures is quite important, and I want to develop on that if I have time time allows me. And at the same time, Itakura Sumiko was really an amateur kind of painter, but she had got a population and reputation. And if we make the comparison with the case of Lefebvre and other Vietnamese painters, you can find out the reason. You can guess the reason why she was so popular. So this is the preliminary introduction. And before entering to the 1920s, I at least have to explain what had been the preliminary conditions for the Japanese artist. As you know, Ernest Fenolsa came to Japan, and he discovered the Oriental painting, Oriental art, which was not yet discovered. And one of his disciples and translator was Okakura Kakuzo. He was going to become a very important person. And that Fenolsa, and he was immersed in Japanese art scene under the Japanism, was saying this. And it was the obituary to Whistler. I quote, "Oriental influence was no accident, no ephemeral ripple on the world's art stream, but a second main current of human achievement sweeping around into the ancient European channel and thus isolating the 300-year-long island of academic extravagance." What the academic extravagance mean? There are three things: linear perspective, and clair obscur, and chiaroscuro, and a very basic exercise of drawing. I begin with the linear perspective, which was introduced in Japan around 1940s. But for example, Katsushika Hosai completely deconstructed that perspective linear. As you see, instead of the infinite vanishing position, he subdivided vanishing position into double, and it's no longer in the infinite distance. And then the horizontal line, which is also very important for the Western technique, as the eye line goes to the horizon. But he subdivided the horizon in such a way. But in my opinion, Edouard Manet, for example, was intentionally practicing the same kind of deconstructed perspective in such a way that he made and destabilized the academic teaching. As you can see, and several examples would testify to my hypothesis. It's my personal hypothesis that most of the Manet specialists wouldn't agree with me. But Manet himself has shown that he had already seen that kind of subdivided composition with a Japanese style. And also the second thing on chiaroscuro, and the same person, Fenolsa, was saying that Caravaggioesque chiaroscuro must be replaced by the Oriental notion of notan. Notan is a Japanese expression, and in the traditional Chinese painting treatise, there is no term used in that context. And you can see the difference quite clearly here. And of course, as you know, and from Whistler on, and the Impressionist, and the painting is not aimed at reproducing the reality, but it was aiming at the tonal harmony in the general surface of the painting. And Fenolsa himself found out some similarity between Whistler's experiences with the traditional Japanese and Chinese ink painting. And one of the disciples of Fenolsa, Asa Dao. Do you heard of him? His textbook composition was so popular. The first edition was published in 1899. And as you see, as you see here, there is no indication of clair obscur, but rather notan is clearly noted here. Line and notan are so important. You can see what he was saying on the right side. Clair obscur is on roundness and solidarity, and it's lead to sculpture, so it's nothing to do with the painting. And his book was so influential all over Europe. And Kandinsky comes in this context. And there is a very famous text, Über das geistige Kunst, which was published in 1998. And as you see, Kandinsky was saying what is important in a painting is, in a sense, Formensprache, form language, and Farbensprache and color, color language, which was to be combined to give the inner Krange, he says, the inner, how to say, ringing of the spirit, which must be expressed. And not only Hermann Bahr on your right side, but Richard Mutter, the German-speaking art critics, were supportive of that idea. And which did this German idea of Jahr von der Wende was retranslated or overlapped with an Oriental notion, Qin Shandong, Qin Seido, translated as spiritual rhythm and vital movement. And it was so popular in the context of Nervenkunst, which is the Wiener Fandsiècle context of the neuron art, if you can, I can say. And a typical example can be seen in the Egon Schiele. And in Japanese reception of the Wiener Secession, the Japanese found that Egon Schiele's painting has some similarity with the Japanese way of, and Oriental way of expressing the feeling of the neuron system. And it was nobody else than a friend of James Whistler by the name of Arthur Jerome Eddy, and who was saying that neither, I quote, the Cubism nor Kandinsky traveled a very distinguished Japanese expert, because that is quite in the spirit of the best Japanese art in Europe art. And unfortunately, these were, there is no equivalent in English. So he used the term esoragato. And he is also mentioning the living movement, which is nothing but the living movement. Seido, Kin Seido, that Oriental, very old notion was applied here to explain the newest thesis on aesthetics developed by Kandinsky. And this was the condition in the fin de siècle Europe. And now I'm turning to what was happening in Japan in parallel. At first, between 76 and 83, the first established an official art school was Kobe Bijutsu-gakko. And I translated into German because the notion is quite similar, Technische Hochschule in der Kunst. But it was abolished within 7 years. And later, Tokyo Bijutsu-gakko was founded in 1887, as you know. And Okakura Tenshin, as I mentioned, took initiative. But at that school, neither the linear perspective, nor chiaroscuro, nor the drawing was not maintained. It was abolished and to convert it into the purely Oriental way of training painting. And it was only after the return of Kuroda Seiki on your right that the newly department of oil painting was established in as late as 1898. And here is a very famous, I would say, Orientalist painting made by Japanese and with his wife as a model. And Asai Chu, in a precedent generation, he was a graduating student from the Kobe Bijutsu-gakko, which was abolished within 7 years. I went to Paris in 1900 as for the Exposition Universelle. As you see in the center, it is from Grère-sur-Loire, and his traditional training shows very well how he was skillful in making that. But he made a discovery of Art Nouveau while he was in Paris. And this kind of design flower maquette was produced after his return. And of course, he did meet Siegfried Samuel Bing in Art Nouveau here. And here is one of the examples of his painting of kakemono with Japanese style, which he created shortly after his return to Paris. And this is my hypothesis. It is quite clear that during his stay, Asai Chu certainly saw Pierre Bonnard's work here. And with a very Japanese style technique was employed. Not only the decorative folding screen, but the brush stroke is quite oriental and a flat surface. And the space arrangement is articulated between high on the long distance and low in the near. So the rejection of linear perspective. And of course, you can see that chiaroscuro is completely lacking. So as I indicated here, there's a kind of loop. This morning we talked about loop between the European Japonism and Japanese tradition that as I rediscovered when he was in Paris. And this is the preliminary condition before 1920s. I'm going to talk about that period which our exhibition treats. And Yasui Sotaro is one of the disciples, the best disciple of Asai Chu that I have just talked. And when coming to Paris, he made his training at Academy Julian, I think, and very academic training was done. But at the same time, he discovered Paul Cézanne in the Perrin collection. So you can see the combination between the nude and bather and Cézanne motif with a very academic anatomy. And this painter has difficulty and has I use the term influence, so deeply influenced by Cézanne during his stay that he had such a difficulty in returning to Japan to find out his own style. It took almost 20 years before he could establish his own new Japanese style of painting. And I'll return to this right side painting later. And also the case was Umehara Ryuzaburo. Umehara was also the disciple, one of the best disciples of Asai Chu. And in his case, he was so deeply moved by Auguste Renoir. And you can see the brush strokes and the coloration is not quite the same, but anyway, you can see Renoir's influence quite evident. And Umehara went all the way to Cagnes-sur-Mer to have a direct lesson, to get a direct lesson from the old master of Impressionism. And it is quite curious and ironical to say that both Yasui and Umehara had to wait for the 1930s to establish his own style. Yasui's case with Lama Temple in Chengdu, and somebody has already visited there, with a geometrical huge brick building with a limpid sky was necessary for Yasui, just as Umehara's case, he needed the Forbidden City in Beijing with green foliage and red-orange roof tiles with deep green sky and so on and so forth. As you know, this period and Chengdu and Beijing was occupied by Japanese army. So under Japanese imperialism and depending on the heritage of Chinese Qing dynasty, that these two painters could finally achieve the lesson, achieve his painting by digesting the lesson that they had already received almost 25 or 30 years before. So it took such a long time to make to attain the maturity, but it was only in the context of Imperial Japan that they could achieve that kind of things. This was a top ranking. This morning we talked about how to evaluate the works, but these two are regarded as the highest achievement of the Japanese oil painting in the 20th century. And this explains the position of Fujita, and Fujita is so famous, and we have talked of him yesterday already. And you can see his technique was dependent on the Japanese and Chinese ink with a very special brush, which is called mensofude, which is used by the drawer of the Estampes Japanese print of the Edo period, just to depict the physiognomy and the hair. And this is a very special kind of brush. And the problem is that he used that brush on an oil-covered canvas. The ink is water diluted. How was it possible? As a medium, he used baby powder. So there is a secret. But at the same time, that secret is quite eclectic. But that eclecticism was really necessary, indispensable for Fujita to make his painting famous in Parisian context. And yeah, on the right side painting, I have so many things to say, so I had to skip. But the popular art, imagerie populaire in French, was very important for him. And he has some difficulty in anatomy. He was not so good at in making three-dimensional composition, but that flatness and his quasi-intentional weak point was very beneficial for him because he was in the Art Deco decorative period. And here is one of the examples, which is very famous at the Cité Internationale Université de Paris. And Setsuma Yasuki, the Maison Satsuma, has just founded, and Fujita has commissioned, and which is one of the largest panel which subsists. So now, at the same time, in which context Fujita and other Japanese painters are working in Paris, and to explain this, we had to come back to what was happening in Parisian art scene in the 1920s. I make a very brief explanation. So as you see, the academic finish was already abandoned, and brushstroke must remain there, and with some kind of affinities with intimist and the way of deconstructed painting was so important, and Pierre Bonnard, Edouard Vuillard was a typical case. And also the geometrical, very schematic cubism was receding to a rather more moderate, recipe-like cubism, which was taught in the salon, directed by André Lotto, for example. You can see the difference quite clearly within 15 years. And also in the case of André Durand, the Fauvisme, the color and the complementary color was subdued into a very dark and kind of portrait. And as you see here, le retour à l'ordre, return to the order, was the dominant tendency at that period, as we have already seen. In the case of Maurice de Vlaminck, and it is also quite clear, the early epoch of Fauvism with a very violent brushstroke was replaced by a very textile and fluid painting, which saw a kind of maturity, but a kind of professionalism is also quite transparent. And that kind of conservatism with eclecticism, and also a kind of return to the classical, and which is quite typical in the case of Maurice Denis, and he was a fervent believer in Roman Catholic. And as you see on the right side, what was happening as eclecticism in the 1920s was the model for the Japanese. Denis saw Japan on the red side, but Japan began to see Denis as one of the leading painter, teacher in the 1920s in the lineage of Paul Cézanne and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of contradiction in the cross purposes between Japanese intention of catching up with the latest avant-garde and European tendency of returning to the order. And this painting is actually in Japan. It's quite curious that here is a Japanese flag. And of course, this is an indication to the École de Pont-Aven and Paul Gauguin and so forth. But I have to say that Maurice Denis made that genealogy a posteriori, retrospectively after his establishment of his own return to classicism. We must be very careful. And instead of these cross purposes, in generally speaking, we had to see that from the fin de siècle to the 1920s, that European tendency of painting, the latest tendency, is drawing nearer and nearer to the contemporary Japanese painting. You see the two folding screen, and of course, on formal level, you can see quite clearly the similarity between the two. And Hashimoto Kansetsu comes into this context. His work is exhibited for this present show, but it is quite curious and quite exceptional in the creation of Hashimoto Kansetsu, and I'm wondering why. And Hashimoto Kansetsu was saying that a kind of reverse was happening between European painting and Japanese painting. While Japanese painting and the drawing, the line was very important, but nowadays the line has completely disappeared. And expressive lines were so important in Japan, in Oriental painting, but which disappeared. While on the contrary, Cézanne was using visible, brush strokes. So there's a kind of reversal which happened. And he is saying, I quote, previously it has been said that the Japanese painting consisted in drawing, whereas the Western painting is made of color pigment covering the surface. In recent years, however, in 1920s, the Western painting shows excitingly vivid brush strokes, while younger artists in Japanese styles and in Japan shows dexterity in vague shading and gradation as if confecting frosted glass. And if you make the comparison, it's quite clear. And I am showing the two paintings with the same size. And upon this observation, Hashimoto Kansetsu was saying that the Oriental painting is superior to the European latest tendency, and Oriental painting, European painting is only now catching up with the Oriental tradition. I quote, the idealistic, that means Kandinsky, that idealistic movement, which has become recently prominent in Europe, is nothing new in the East as a vision. Expressionists claim that it is only after its birth that art could discover a new method for its manifestation. But this statement reveals their lack in serious search of the Oriental tradition. As I have already stated elsewhere, Expressionism stems from the subjective depiction of the Orientals and has been practiced much earlier in the East. This is a very ideologic statement, of course, but the Chinese intellectuals in the Shanghai modernism literally quoted from this quote. It is very important. And his own creation was like that. So you can see that the concept example now in the exhibit is quite exceptional. And you can see what the motif at the subject matter. Have you seen Ups? Have you seen, who has seen Mulan? And he already made make the reference for the classical Chinese literature, and he also donated to the United States one of his series of Mulan. And of course, the usage of the folding screen is he made intentionally because he did know that it was quite en vogue in Europe. And he was also saying that Expressionism was already in Orient. And the best example would be here. Vincent van Gogh was at first named as Expressionist by a German critic. And Xu Beihong was quite conscious of that. He did know that this kind of painting, which is quite exceptional for him, is quite eloquently speaking to the European audience, European spectator, because of the Van Gogh was becoming, already recognized painter by that period. And in the same context, the same year, Koide Narashige came also in Paris, but he had a very uncomfortable experience here. And on the left side, there is a rare oil painting that he made. Why from the interior? Because he didn't like cold. And he was so afraid of getting out. And I can identify the place, L'Hôtel Somnard, which is quite near from the Pantheon. And the hotel did exist. And the prefectural police is just beside. And there are many Japanese painters who are staying there. And he is saying this. He felt that he was facing a kind of transparent wall of glass in front of him. He cannot penetrate the Parisian art market, but most of his compatriots was quite naively enjoying the Parisian life, but he felt that he was very alienated. And he was saying, there is something immovable, heavy, a kind of inviolability which stubbornly subsists in Europe. In contrast, Japanese art, he says, I quote, shows in general quality reminiscent of the delicacy of paper or sliding door, a kind of fleeting softness, quite insubstantial, and he said, just like a floating ghost. And he continued in this way. So how to do for the Japanese and the future of the Japanese painting. The modern French painters sought simplification, freedom, omission, primitives, lines. I explained what line means, amateurism and barbarism. The Western strove to destroy the form in recent half a century, whereas the Japanese already had a great skill in drawing shapes that could not be further distorted. Already, and the form was distorted. And he said this was so fortuitous and fortunate that in modern Japanese Western painting, we, the Japanese, are doing things, it's quite funny, as if we were getting a new wife by using someone else's divorce certificate. Western divorce certificate justified the Japanese practice of introducing the quasi-phobism or something like that. Yeah? And this is a very a strong irony, and he was saying fortunate, but of course it's in contresens, and it's a very bad omen, of course. And what he was doing, he was not imitating Cézanne as Yasui Sotaro tried to do one generation earlier, but he, instead of imitating Cézanne's form, he followed Cézanne's spirit, the spirit of not imitating anybody. And you can see here his expression after his return to Japan, a kind of fluidity and with a kind of, oil painting materiality is flooding in the painting. And in his final years, he made really good, exceptional works. And this is one of the lessons that Koide, in his very short stay in Paris, only 6 months, has achieved those. He began to understand something. And this is also one of the top-ranking painting in this context in my understanding, aesthetic judgment. And this will probably show, in contrast, what Fujita was doing here. As I have already explained, this pigment brush is quite special, and which remind us of the tradition of lost ukiyo-e print. And as you know, ukiyo print has already devastated and disappeared by that period. At the end of the 1890s, by the end of the 19th century, the printing industry introduced the mechanical typography and xylography and calligraphy, lithography replaced the handmade woodblock printing. So the woodblock printing tradition has already disappeared from Japan. And it was in this context that he tried to make a kind of synthesis between the so-called Oriental aesthetic as perceived by the Westerns, and not returning to the tradition, he made a kind of renovation. This was the only path possible to make his reputation. But at the same time, his technique was taxed from time to time, criticized as a secondary or a minor art, which remind us of the artisan kind of works which are made for children, and as if it were the children's toy. And this brings me to Yamamoto Kanae. Yamamoto Kanae was the first generation who get rid of the ukiyo tradition, and he began his career as the craftsman of engraving, but he claimed to make the independent printing, and here in the Seoul there is one specialist on that area. And upon coming to Japan in 1920, for example, he went to Brittany. You can understand quite well. It's in the footsteps of Paul Gauguin and École de Pont-Aven, and that kind of primitivism was necessary to get rid of the heritage of Japanese ukiyo print. And Hasegawa Kiyoshi, as I mentioned earlier, was the direct disciple, the second generation of that creative print sosakuhanga, which is the equivalent of estampe originale in French case. 10 minutes? Wow. And this accounts for the reason why Fujita wanted to make a huge panel of wall painting during his war. And in his final years, he made the church decoration, and he converted in Christianity. And he wanted to become the maître, in the sense of to make the cantar in French expression. And it was his last year. And he wanted to get the reputation worthy of the name of Leonard. It clearly named after Leonardo da Vinci, of course. So coming to Art Deco in 1925, we have already had explanation, and Hamanaka Katsu was quoted this morning, so I don't repeat, but precisely you can understand better now why Hamanaka was saying that kind of declaration toward the Japanese lacquer makers. And I simply want to mention that Hamanaka was working in collaboration with, as you know, Jean Dunant and Aileen Gray and so on and so forth. And Alice Aimee must be put into the same context. And Alice Aimee was collaborating with Japanese lacquer, artisan lacquer technicians, which are sent to Vietnam by nobody else than Okakura, and they made a collaboration. And this kind of tandem collaboration was necessary, and the triple collaboration with the graduating young students of the Hanoi art school was very essential. So there is a kind of triangular collaboration which was already appearing. And in addition, I had to say that in 1923, already Okakura's main book, very famous, The Book of Tea, was translated as Livre du Thé. And the top ranking and initiator of Hanoi's, Vietnamese modern art movement, Phan Quyen, did read the Livre du Thé, and he made a very critical commentary on that. So it's also a very important chapter. And the reason why I'm talking about it is Alex Aimee was working with Maurice Denis in the Atelier de l'Art Sacré. And the same Maurice Denis was befriended Kuroda Jutaro, another Japanese painter, but also theorician. And Kuroda Jutaro's influence on Maurice Denis is quite obvious from this comparison. And he was a theorician, and he was very fluent in French. So he made many publications, including Cézanne and after Cézanne, or Maurice Denis and Simpliste and so forth, 1920 and 21, shortly before his second coming to Paris. And these were, of course, based on Maurice Denis' writings. And he made many publications, like a biography of Van Gogh, which is based on Theodore Duret's book. And he also made a relation of the trips to Europe. And Singapore in between was also described with illustrations. I have to skip. It's quite interesting, but probably for next conference. And in the same ship, there was one thinker and writer by the name of Komatsu Kiyoshi. He is very important in the Vietnamese context. And he made, for example, Indochina, which was published in 1941. And by chance, in the same ship, there was one very famous and in the future famous person, nobody else than Nguyen Ai Quoc, future Ho Chi Minh. So Komatsu was befriended Ho Chi Minh. So he was suspected to be the Japanese secret agent. And together with Japanese painters, they were not under custody, but they are under surveillance. The French secret police was making a surveillance, and there is the document in the Archives Nationales. I found it. So there is an interesting connection, not only in artist milieu, but in connection with the social movement and the revolutionaries and so on and so forth. But at the same time, for example, here, Ono Chikyo and Tsukida Baksen, they are the Kyoto school, very representative of the Japanese style painters. And they work together with Kuroda. And Kuroda, as a tour conductor because he was fluent in French and Italian and so forth. You see here in Ashiji, and presumably Kuroda took the photo. And in this context, you can find out that the Japanese style paintings here in the case of Yukisome is not compatible or comparable, commensurable in the French taste. And I'm quite curious why these paintings were collected by Central Pompidou and presented in the context in the 1920s. And probably there is some misunderstanding between the Japanese side and the European side, and we have to make really investigation into that area. But in Tsuchida Bakusen, and Japanese style painter, not only bought one piece of Cézanne Basel, but also he tried to learn the cubist construction of the painting. As you can see, these are training that he made in some private ateliers in Paris, and which is quite evident. He is trying to make that kind of composition, and it was a weak point for him. And the esquisse that you find in the exhibition was for the preparation of this painting, and you can see this is cubism, right? With cone cylinder and face-free following the lesson by Cézanne, and in his correspondence, he tried to make the foliage with cone and cylinder and circle and so on and so forth. So he was very curious and very keenly sensitive for the latest development. And we talk about cubism, but there is no cube. And also this comparison is quite interesting. And he was trying to make the triangular structure and learned from Edouard Manet. And you have to know, it's only around that time, and in 1931 precisely, that Edouard Manet finally was recognized as classic in the modern art history. We make quite often the mistakes. And even at that date, an entering of Edouard Manet in the public collection, there was a controversy. You had to know it. And Kuroda Jyutaro, he himself was making the Puto school of moderate cubism, but which was once introduced in Japan, was harshly criticized by the avant-gardist Yorozu Tetsugoro. He was saying, what's the merit of learning that kind of stupid work going all the way to Paris and so forth? So there is a controversy in Japan. But at the same time, unfortunately, Kishida and Koide and Kuroda found a private school in Osaka, Shinadobachi Yosha Kenkyujo. The naming is quite clear. Anyway, it's a kind of École des Beaux-Arts, private École des Beaux-Arts, Shinonomachi, which followed the Parisian private art schools that they frequented during his stay. And the promotion of a new generation of younger artists in the Kansai area was quite important. And you know that period is precisely after the great Kanto earthquake. The Tokyo and the area was completely devastated. So Osaka area had some privilege of making a new school here at the building. And the success of Kuroda's books, studies of composition, which include Cubist and Matisse, and he made the analysis, as well as Koide's book, as I have already mentioned, was very great success. And it was also a fruit of their stay in Paris. And I skipped this, and there is some criticism, but I skipped. And you see, we had to, this morning we had a discussion about it. We really need to make a kind of typology of the painters, and in three categories in general. Kawashima Riichiro, for example, he was teaching Fujita Tsuharu, but Fujita didn't talk about him. It's quite curious, but he was so important. You see Théâtre Châtelet and Hôtel de Ville, And also Okashikanosuke, he stayed quite long, and he had some struggle, technical struggle also, to be welcomed in the Parisian Salon. And just take Saiki Yuzo to finish my talk. And as you know, Saiki Yuzo died also quite young, at the age of 30 or 31. And you have that masterpiece called Nui. And you see, and I would say that the war was so important because it's the sedimentation of the history of Paris. And on that, he made the letters. The letters are no longer oil painting, but a kind of Oriental calligraphy, which was put on the history of the war by the Japanese style, Oriental style brushstroke. So this is a kind of combination, but it was a kind of, in French, écriture de la vie. It's the writing of, not painting, writing of his own life. And he was suffering from tuberculosis, and he was to die quite young, but he concentrated every of his effort into this painting. And the war is half open. It's at the same time openness and rejectedness. And he was in front of some transparent glasses, as Koide has explained. And he was hesitating, but he was trying to penetrate into the secret of Parisian art. So with this or two or three, I stop momentarily. We talked about Sakata Kazuo this morning, so I don't repeat. But anyway, he was one of the best cubists, and he replaced Leger when Leger was ill, and he was so highly estimated. But after he returned to Japan, he stayed in Paris for more than 10 years. He didn't join Tokyo, the capital city, but he recruited into his hometown, Okayama, and he wanted to maintain his independence. So that kind of independence is quite rare, but those who stayed quite long in Paris could not reintegrate it in the Japanese mainstream art market or a group of artists. So his isolation was something quite symptomatic. And Fujita's case also taken into account in the same context. As I said, it was necessary for him with international renown to make the war painting during the war, but because of that, he was persecuted by his friends and comrades because he had such a high reputation in Paris, so he was a target of the jealousy. So he left Paris in 1949 and never returned to Japan. This is a kind of political exile, which is quite rare in Japanese case. And the same is true with Noguchi Yonejiro. He was a poet, and probably you have never heard of him, but he has very numerous friends in India, and his son is quite famous. Isamu Noguchi is an illegitimate son of Noguchi Yonejiro. Noguchi was very famous as a poet before the war, but because of his cooperation in the war, he was ostracized. And Noguchi, as you see, was studying with Constantin Brancusi in 1927, and after that he retired. And after the war, and he is photographed by Okamoto Taro. And the beautiful lady I'm going to talk a little bit later. And with this, I may finish. Yokomitsu Riichi, a very famous writer, he also turned into the right wing, and he was ostracized also. But after Saiki's death, he was saying, in the first album of Saiki, and posthumous album, we feel the state of crisis which overflows from Saiki's canvas. While the European famous masters like Utoriro, painter has overcome the crisis, or in Utoriro's case, it's like a decline, as you know. But Saiki died without overcoming that difficulty. And he said, but is it enough to go out triumphantly from the hardship? Rather, it's in his struggle of hardship that the best paintings was created. So in conclusion, Yokomitsu was saying, Saiki died in place of many others. So there are many other mediocre painters, but Saiki went to the limit of their possibilities. So this is one of the anecdote that I want to transmit to you. And Okamoto Taro, he is the surrealist in Japan, and we have one piece during his stay in the exhibit. With him, the post-war art scene in Japan is going to develop. So I began my talk with Itakura, and with 2L, because R and L is quite difficult for pronunciation, and Itakura wanted to make his name conspicuous, so instead of Itakura, he made Itakura. And this couple can be classified also in the prematurely dead artist, which was quite heroic, and which was a very important chapter of Japanese artist experience in Paris in the 1920s. So for the moment I finish here, the dear discussion wanted to continue, but I stop here. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Inaga Sensei. As always, every time I hear Inaga Sensei speak, I'm just truly at awe by his boundless kind of polymathic knowledge of art and social histories. I guess by listening to your lecture today, it was really clear that instead of looking at, say, Paris and Japan, this bipolar kind of points of references, it's really important to acknowledge the presence of multiple reference points that unfolded this kind of circular, how you call the spiral form and mode of artistic exchange. And within, and at the same time for the Japanese artists, I know that you included in your original manuscript for today's paper that they had to kind of navigate this very narrow margin of space in between the accepted sort of otherness and the homogeneity to be rejected while they were in Paris. I'm wondering if we could kind of bring your discussion closer to the City of Others exhibition. When we were going through the exhibition yesterday, you highlighted that this area of nude painting was something that particularly kind of drew your attention, and whether your proposed concept and framework of the circular artistic mode of artistic exchange, the spiral mode of artistic exchange, could also be applied in seeing works of nude paintings by Asian artists.
Yeah. For example, already in the exhibit there is a comparison, and the Asian artists are struggling to, because there are so many different styles, and at the same time, as Lisa said, there is a kind of homogeneity is rejected, but complete heterogeneity is also rejected. So in between the gap, they had to search for the way to show their originality and acceptability, and at the same time not return to the old-fashioned tradition, Oriental tradition. And next, please. And of course, it is the most fantastic and very popular one. But yeah, people are so enthusiastic. But at the same time, yeah, for the Asian artist with Confucian ethic background, how to treat the nude was a very important problem. And at the same time, the anatomy of the academy was no longer useful. So how to combine with the ink painting technique and brush strokes was very a problem. And Augustin Rodin was already making some kind of tentative with the Japanese context, and Isamu Noguchi have just explained. After leaving Paris, he went to Beijing, and he learned Chi Bai Shi, and what he did was nude with ink, ne? And Chi Bai Shi desu ne. And in extension of your question, the realism debate was going on in China between these two famous guys, and these two examples quite show the contrast. And probably why not? We can consider these nude these post-academic training nude, how to do with that. These Japanese tentatives must be compared with other, for example, Indian and Vietnamese cases. And of course, we had to remember that for Islamic and for Muslim people, and the figuration was also almost forbidden. So they had to. We have to consider their attentive in a different context, but it's also closely connected with that aesthetic problem. Yeah.
My next question concerns the women artists. I think in your sharing today, we saw many images of women, representation of women, but I think Sumiko Itakura, so Itakura Sumiko was the only female artist we got to spoke about. Can we also imagine a similar kind of network of women artists, Asian artists, using your framework?
Yeah, thanks very much. This is a very good question. And in preparation for the talk, I was also thinking about that. And yeah, 少し先にしちゃっていいですかね。We can come back to yeah, very briefly, in connection with this, is all right? Yeah, female, そうか。女性の female painter, it comes at last. So how to do that? Yeah, before that, very shortly, I wanted to talk about fashion. I didn't know that fashion was also included in the exhibition. And here is Kojima Torajiro. He was also suspected to be a spy, Japanese agent, but he was very famous, and he got the Salon d'Automne in 1920 with Chimae Chogori, the Korean lady. And Korean peninsula was under Japanese rule. And also he was very famous for the Virgin lady with kimono. And curiously, they are liberated from corset. And precisely in that context, Paul Poiret invented dresses with and in the case of Madeleine Violet, which is presented in the exhibition, she was making a kind of Japanese invention, which is already in exhibit. And you see, it's precisely the same period. And it was in that context that so-called Qibao China dress came into popularity. And there's a connection between Shanghai and Paris. And before that, I mentioned this, and this is a very famous portrait of a Japanese lady. She was working in Manchuria just after the establishment of the puppet monarchy of Manchuria, and she came all the way to sit to Yasui. And why Chinese dress? And on the right side, Li Shanran, you have already seen, she was once the wife of Isamu Noguchi. So everything connected. So from kimono to Chinese dress, and finally come to. Can I continue? Yeah, ごめんなさい、もう時間とかして。Yeah, Amrita Shagil, we talked about her, and as you see, the Korean ladies and Pan-Yurian, they are almost the same generation. Why they are so famous as famous first generation artists? We have to take into account the political background after the Versailles Treaty, and they are educated. And Chen Chin's case from Taiwan, she made a study in Tokyo Women's Art School, and just as the case of Nahe Sok, a Korean first oil painter. And also the same generation, why not in Mexico? And precisely the same generation, Akinofuku, she went to India, and those who know can quite easily understand what it is. Gujarat painting with mural painting made by women. And she befriended these ladies, and she visited quite often Kachi after the war. So there is a kind of unbounded friendship among the female artists, and why not the very famous lady, あれ名前出てこなくちゃったとか言っちゃったね。ウングワーレ・エミリーね。 is also from the same generation, and she is really the incarnation of primitivism worldwide, the ultimate kind of.
In terms of her reception.
Yes. So probably in the future we can make another exhibition by reconstructing that invisible network of womenhood.
Thank you. I do have more questions, but I think we're running out of time soon. So can I ask the floor if there are any questions? One? Okay, if that's the case, maybe I can ask one more question. I think in thinking about the Japanese artists, that this kind of specificity of their condition, I was looking at the examples you shared today of Umehara Ryuzaburo and Yasuda Sotaro, who after they came back to Japan, it took them a while to kind of reorient their artistic position and approach. And you mentioned that it was only through their time in Northeast China, particularly Beijing or Chengde, under the Japanese invasion, right, already by this time, that kind of they reacquired or reattained the approach that they had been exposed to and internalized while they were in Paris. I'm curious to know whether, for the Japanese artists who were in China, who represented the images of China, was there any interaction that they had with the Chinese artists locally in Beijing or in China at that time, or were they sort of circulating within this very colonial network? Because that's probably something quite unique to Japanese.
Yeah, this is a very good question. Thanks very much. Yeah, unfortunately, Yasui and Umehara went to Beijing or to Chengde because of the establishment of the Japanese colonial empire. It's later than that. So it was already quite difficult to have a direct contact with the Chinese painter. But for example, there is a pastel painter by the name Yazaki, and he traveled all around Japan. He is belonging to the earlier generation, but he was staying in Beijing and teaching and painting there. And he was befriended Shubei Hon. And after Yazaki death, he remained in Beijing, and he died there in 1947, 48. And all his pastels, more than 600, was protected and preserved by
Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing.
And which we have rediscovered almost 10 years ago. And there is a monograph. So among the artists, there is a kind of solidarity which is beyond the political problem. And, the friendship was very important. And there was that kind of Japanese who are really get the, sincere friendship with the Chinese painters. And we have to dig out another question because some of the Korean painters who are staying in Beijing did also know Yazaki, and they exchanged their portrait, and they are executing the landscapes together. We have already discovered it quite recently. So, and that area must be investigated and, rediscovered from now on.
For those of us studying Southeast Asian art history, I think we're familiar with the name Yazaki Chiyoji, the pastel painter, who became one of the mentors teachers of Sujo Yono, and they took drawing trips together in Java during the 30s. Yeah. All right, I think that brings us to the end, and the spiral of network will continue. And thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much, Inaga Sensei.
We are now ready to begin our final keynote lecture, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Lefebvre, director of the Musée Cernuschi in Paris. I hope I'm saying it correctly. His lecture, Chinese Artists in Paris, Networks and Connections from One Generation to Another, Dr. Lefebvre will explore the rich and complex presence of Chinese artists in Paris across the 20th century, highlighting how their movements between Europe and Asia and within both continents shaped not only their own artistic practices, but also the broader cross-cultural currents of modern art. From Xu Beihong and San Yu in the interwar period to the later influence of artists like Wu Guanzhong and Zhao Qi, Dr. Lefebvre will guide us through the evolving networks that connected these generations and the significance of their Parisian experience. Dr. Lefebvre holds a PhD in art history from the Sorbonne University with research focus on cultural heritage in pre-modern China. As director of the Musée Cernuschi, he has curated numerous landmark exhibitions like From Chinese Artists in Paris in 2011 to Song of Spring, Pan Yuliang in Paris in 2018, and most recently, The Journey of Ink in 2024. His work has been central in deepening the appreciation of both historical and contemporary Chinese art in France and globally. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Eric Lefebvre.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Many thanks to the National Gallery of Singapore for this invitation to share our research on Asian artists in Paris. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be here today. I am going to talk about 3 generations of Chinese artists in Paris, their networks and connections. Regarding this research, I should say first that it started as an object-based investigation as I was working on the Cernuschi Museum collection a few years ago. The Cernuschi Museum was founded in 19th century Paris near the Parc Monceau, and in 1874 it was the first building designed on the purpose of displaying Asian art in Paris. The museum then housed a collection of ancient Chinese and Japanese art that continued to develop through the 20th century up to date. But interestingly, the Cernuschi Museum took a distinctive orientation when, after the Second World War, the curators opened the doors of the museum to modern and contemporary Asian art with a focus on Chinese painting. And one example is this exhibition of Zhang Daitian in the early 60s in the Cernuschi Museum. While I was working on the history of the making of the modern Chinese painting collection of the museum, I realized that this new trend could not be explained without considering the presence of Chinese artists in France since the 1920s and investigating their social and artistic network. The first result of this research was an exhibition devoted to Chinese artists in Paris. The exhibition was divided between an indoor and an outdoor space. Inside the museum, there were artworks from the first and second generation of Chinese artists in France, from Lin Fengmian to Zhao Wuqi. And in the nearby Parc Monceau, there were installations and sculptures from the third generation, including Wang Keping and Shen Yuan in the distance. Since then, the museum developed regularly exhibitions and research on Asian artists in Paris. Let's just quote 2 examples. Seoul, Paris, Seoul for Korea in 2016, and most recently, Vietnam with a special exhibition on Lefebvre, Mai Tu, and Phu Cao Dam. And finally, this year, we are opening a resource center devoted to Asian artists in France at the museum. So when working on these different communities of artists, we can always question, like in the National Gallery exhibition, who are the others? As we are always the authors of someone else. And the classical vision of the modernist period in Paris, inherited from the 20th century, did include a diversity of artists coming from all over the world. but some of them were more visible than others. Many artists came from Western Europe, and we can say that they came to France as neighbors. And a second important group of artists, this is the first group, yes, very, very familiar names. And there were a second group coming from Russia. And of course, American artists joined them. Now, if we consider the artists coming from Asia, we realize that only a few of them were mentioned in the classical narratives of modernist Paris written in the 20th century. Except Fujita, almost none of the other artists mentioned on this slide were included in these narratives. There were others among the others, and it's only since a few years that art historians started to include Asian artists with African and South American artists in a more complex and accurate version of the history of modern art movements in this city. Now, if we consider the case of the Chinese artists active in Paris between the 1920s and the 1930s, we realize that they shared the same fate. None of the Chinese artists that came to France before the Second World War were fully recognized as actors of the modern movement in Paris during their life, even if some of them were already very famous in China. The situation was different for the second and third generation of Chinese artists in France, and we will try to understand why by investigating the artist networks. Another important preliminary question is, how can we define a generation? Of course, the artists mentioned here were all born about the turn of the century. But for many historians, the concept of generation is only socially significant if a group of persons born during the same decade are collectively experienced major events with a deep impact on the society they are living in. In the case of those Chinese artists, they obviously shared a common experience: their travel to France and training in Paris in the 1920s. But beyond this, we should also consider them as members of the generation of the May 4th, 1919, which started with the political protest against the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, but had a huge influence on the modernization of education and the social status of the woman, among other aspects. If we now consider the second generation of artists, we can see that they were born around 1920, and that they arrived in France in the late 1940s and early 1950s. For them, the major event they have been facing is, of course, the Second World War, which forced artists like Wu Guanzhong, Zhao Wuji, and Zhu Dejun to leave the eastern provinces of China when they were studying to seek refuge in Western China, especially in Sichuan, with their professors and classmates. And for the last generation of artists, born in the late 40s and 50s, they experienced the Cultural Revolution during their youth and could not develop their artistic training practice inside or outside academies before the late 70s and 80s. So this brings us to the question of art education. Art education was actually a major question, maybe the major question, for the first generation of Chinese artists that came to France. And Cai Yuanpei is, of course, a key personality of this period. With a personal knowledge of Europe, where he was partially trained himself, he developed a personal vision of education. And due to the major political position he occupied, he could establish the first modern education institutions in China. And actually, it was Cai Yuanpei that promoted the training of Chinese artists in Europe, especially in France. Two initiatives, the Work Study Program and the Sino-French Institute of Lyon, were supposed to provide a frame to support the Chinese students in France. Of the two programs, the Sino-French Institute, which was opened between 1921 and 1950, was the more successful. One of the most famous students of the Sino-French Institute was Pai Liang. Here she is. In the center of this picture, with other young Chinese women intellectuals and artists. One of them, the writer Su Xuelin, considered that the strong relationship between the Chinese students in the institute had a negative counterpart, as the Chinese students could not develop contacts with the French students as they could do in French universities or art academies. And for this reason, many students left the institute after a while and continued their studies in fine art school, École des Beaux-Arts in French. So the École des Beaux-Arts of Paris was, of course, an extremely important place for them. Between the 1920s and 1930s, the young Chinese artists, were the most numerous among the foreign students in the academy. So more than extra-European, more than Americans, more than Japanese. This is interesting. The relationship between the Chinese students at the École des Beaux-Arts and their professors had often been considered as a key to understand the development of their practice. And one of the most significant cases is the relationship of Xu Beihong with two of his masters. Xu Beihong's fine-bodied drawing and realistic oil paintings actually share common features with some artworks of his professor, the naturalist painter Fernand Cormon, as can be seen on these artworks collected by the Musée d'Orsay and Petit Palais in Paris. Another French professor of Xu Beihong was Daniel Bouvray. And Xu Beihong developed a close relationship with him even after he left France, as evidenced by this book of his drawings that he sent to Daniel and which is now in the French Library, the French National Library. It is also interesting to note that Xu Beihong kept the self-portrait of Daniel Bouvray in his studio for the rest of his life. And that's this self-portrait over there. So relationship between students and professors could also be developed in the so-called free academies that we already mentioned several times today, but within a more informal atmosphere, which allowed the building of more open networks. It is important to remind the early opening of a studio for women in 1876 at the Académie Julian, and it was 20 years before the École des Beaux-Arts. So when looking at these paintings by Pai Liang, we can measure the diversity of the students working in free academies in terms of gender, geographical origin, and even age. And this aspect is quite important because the École des Beaux-Arts did not accept students over 30, a rule which led many foreign students to pretend to be younger than they were actually, and so they could stay a little longer in the academy. And the Grande Chaumière Academy was one of the most famous of these studios. And there is also a very funny story of Pang Xunqin working side by side with Bourdelle and talking with him without understanding that he was the famous sculptor. And I think this is very significant of the informal relationship between artists of different origin and ages that could develop between the three academies. So in this emulating context, students often learn more from other students than from their professors. And that's the case again of Pang Xunqin, who was deeply inspired by the free use of ink of San Yu. And of course, Pang Xunqin followed this almost surrealist way of painting the nude, as we can see on this slide. So beside the academies and studios, salons were places where the Chinese students could broaden their network. For their first participation, they could have been encouraged or recommended by a professor. If they received a prize, it could serve to get recognition not only in France, but also in China. Prizes could be advertised in the Chinese newspaper, helping to reinforce the network of the artist at home, paving the way for a future career in their own country. And Chang Shu-hong practiced this kind of self-advertising. Among the artists that stayed in France, many of them exhibited every year in different salons. Sometimes they finally became members of the jury of the salon, and this is the case of the sculptor Yan Dehui, here photographed with his sculpture of a dancing gypsy woman. The first artworks by Chinese artists collected by the French Museum had been collected. The first artworks by Chinese artists collected by the French Museum had often been exhibited in salons. In this sense, salon could be a way to establish relationship with the museum curators, even if the artist did not have a student background in French academies. And that was, of course, the case of Liu Haisu, whose painting of the Luxembourg Park over there under the snow was the first artwork by a Chinese artist acquired by a French museum. And of course, you notice that this painting is in the show upstairs. So even after the Second World War, salon remained the major place of visibility for artists of the first generation like Pan Yuliang or San Yu. The rare paintings from those artists acquired by the French public institutions during this period had all been exhibited in salons before. And I think the case of Pan Yuliang is quite significant. She exhibited every year in the salon for more than 30 years, and her works were often commented positively in the press. Besides the salon open both to male and female artists, Pan Yuliang also participated every year to the salon organized by the Union of the Female Painters and Sculptors, which was the first society for women artists in France, founded in 1881. This women artist network was most probably very significant for Pan Yuliang, as it inspired one of her major artwork titled My Friends and I Talking About Painting, which is unfortunately lost. It was this very large painting there, and because it was very large and very important for her, Pan Yuliang first realized a small version which is still extant at the Anhui Provincial Museum. And also, she realized a detailed version of every figure on the painting, including herself here, so here and there, and finally at the middle of this large composition. And of course, she is looking at her own painting and discussing it with her friends. So even if the garden seems rather French in its style, the concept of gathering in a garden to look at paintings and discuss them could be reminiscent of the Chinese elegant gatherings, which are the subjects of so many classical paintings in China. On this interesting picture of Pan Yuliang's studio, we recognize the painting in the background. So we have an ideal gathering there, and in front of it we have the real gathering. And we notice that Pan Yuliang is always in the middle. And this is quite interesting because beside her, it is possible to recognize many members of the Association of Chinese Artists in France, the president Zhou Lin, Hua Tianyou, Yan Dehui, and many others. And this brings us to a very important aspect, which is of the networks of the artists, which is associations. They did play an important role in building networks and bridging the distance between France and the homeland. And associations of Chinese artists were particularly efficient to organize group exhibitions in France. And the first example is the Strasbourg exhibition of 1924. This large exhibition curated by Lefebvre benefited from the patronage of the Chinese embassy, as we can read on the poster of the exhibition. But the Opus Society, Huopusi, which name is mentioned only in Chinese on this incense burner, played an important role in the organization of the exhibition. And the next year, in 1925, the same group of artists, Lin Fengmian, Lin Wenzheng, Wu Daiyu, Liu Qipiao, and Zheng Yilu, gathered around Lin Fengmian to design and curate the Chinese section of the International Decorative Art Exhibition. And in a pioneering article, Craig Clunas identified the key role of two associations in the organization of this event. So the role of the Chinese Artists Association seems to have been quite important until the end of the 1940s. Just after the war, in 1946, the exhibition of the Association of Chinese Artists in France celebrated the achievement of the group of artists that spent the war period in Paris. And the association was actually involved in two exhibition projects in the same time. So one is at the École des Beaux-Arts, as we can see, and the second one was at the Musée Cernuschi. And Hua Tianyou's sculptures can be considered as a visible link between the two exhibition spaces. And it can be read as a bridge between the Art Academy and the museum. So we come now to relationship with museums. As I mentioned in my introduction, 1946 was also a turning point for the Cernuschi Museum with the opening of its first exhibition of Chinese contemporary painting. This exhibition was combining different generations of artists, Qi Baishi, Zhang Datian, but also young Zhao Wuqi, different techniques, oil painting and ink painting, and artists with different backgrounds, as some of them were only active in China, and others have been trained in Europe. And it was, of course, the second major exhibition of Chinese contemporary painting organized in France by a museum, the first one being the 1933 Jeux de Paume exhibition curated by Xu Beihong. These exhibitions were, of course, opportunities to build a network between artists and museum curators. The collaboration between Xu Beihong and the director of the Jeux de Paume Museum, André de Zaroy, ended with a successful exhibition and significant acquisition, and some of them are on display here in the City of Others exhibition. But after the war, the Jeux de Paume Museum was not devoted to foreign contemporary art anymore, and unfortunately, its collection remained in storage for decades. The 1946 exhibition at Cernuschi had a more auspicious fate. René Grousset, the director of the museum, had a clear vision of the present and future of Asia, and he decided to open the museum to contemporary art as a response to the new state of the world after the war. He also developed early relationship with the Chinese artists active in Paris, like Pan Yuliang and Hua Tianyou, who respectively realized his sculpted and painted portrait. A young curator in this time, Vadim Elisiev, helped René Grousset to achieve the contemporary painting exhibition project for the museum. Elisiev had been staying in Western China during the war, acting as a diplomat. He met many Chinese artists during this time in Sichuan, including Zhang Datian and Zhao Wuqi. So besides Grousset and Elisiev, two Chinese men played an important role in this exhibition. One is Guo Youshou, the other is Zhou Lin. The first was a diplomat and a collector, and the second was an historian of art and an artist. Both had been trained in France in the 1920s and 30s, and after the war, Guo Youshou came to France again to join the recently founded UNESCO, as Zhou Lin, who had remained in France, was the president of the Association of the Chinese Artists in Paris. So after lending some of his paintings for the 1946 show, Guo Youshou decided a few years later to donate 70 contemporary Chinese paintings to the museum. And it was the largest donation of modern Chinese painting ever done to a public museum in France. And naturally, this donation deeply influenced the future development of the museum. So that's for Guo Youshou. And as for Zhou Lin, he founded a publishing house and a gallery. And for 20 years, actually until his death, he published all the Chinese painting catalogs of the Cernuschi Museum. So a symbol of the support of Guo Youshou and Zhou Lin to the museum was this gift of a painting by Pan Yuliang, a gift shared with the opera singer Fei Liuli. In fact, since the 1946 exhibition, the museum had been only collecting ink paintings. In this context, the gift of Guo Youshou, Zhou Lin, and Fei Liuli was an attempt to promote oil paintings by Chinese artists trained in France against the ideas that an Asian art museum should only collect contemporary artworks following traditional techniques. And the strong relationship between Guo Youshou and the Cernuschi Museum also allowed the early acquisition of artworks by young artists like Wallace Ting, who was only 27 when Guo Youshou donated this horse painting to the Cernuschi Museum. So another example of the importance of networks in the development of art institutions is the case of the newly founded art academies or university art departments in China. When Ling Fengmian became the first director of the academy in Hangzhou in 1928, many professors around him had been studying in France with him and were already involved in his 1925 decorative art exhibition project. And the same remarks can be done about Xu Beihong and his colleagues in Nanjing Central University. The project, of course, was to bring to China part of the artistic education system that they experienced in France. And a French painter, André Clodeau, was also invited by Ling Fengmian to teach in China, and we can recognize him over there. André Clodeau was from Dijon, the city in which Ling Fengmian was initially trained when he arrived in France before moving to Paris. His wife was also a close friend of Lin Fangmian's French wife, Alice Watton. Once again, early relationship which started in France continued and developed in China. An interesting point is that Clodo shared the interest of Lin Fangmian for a synthesis of Western and Eastern art, and he even tried, as we can see on these pictures, to practice Chinese ink painting in his own way. In Hangzhou, young artists like Zhao Wuji, Wu Guanzhong, or Zhu Dejun benefited from the lessons of their French-trained Chinese professor. The letters exchanged with Wu Daiyu are an evidence of the importance of their early exposure to Western art and culture for the later development of their painting. When, after the war, they finally had the opportunity to travel to France, these artists clearly had the impression to put their feet in the footsteps of their professors. In his autobiography, Zhao Wuji mentioned that when he arrived in Paris, the only word he knew was Montparnasse, and that after 3 days, he moved to an hotel near the Grande Chaumière Academy. The Grande Chaumière Academy was a meeting point for the artists freshly arrived from China. And it was the case for Wu Guanzhong, who arrived in France in 1947 and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts for 3 years. When he was back to France in the 1980s and 90s, Wu Guanzhong did a kind of a personal pilgrimage and went back to the Grande Chaumière for visiting and also for sketching, like in the old days. Back in the 40s and 50s, the Grande Chaumière was actually the place where artists from the first generation, like Pai Yuliang or San Yu, could meet Zhu Dejun, Zhao Wuji, or Wu Guanzhong. Unfortunately, much of the early works of Wu Guanzhong were destroyed, but we still have nude drawings of this period by Zhu Dejun and Zhao Wuji. Some of the contacts with their professors at the Grande Chaumière or at the École des Beaux-Arts were quite important. And we can mention, for instance, among those professors, Otton Fries or Jean Souverbi. And Souverbi had a possible influence on Zhu Dejun. And we can notice some similarities between Zhu Dejun and Souverbi's nude paintings. But we can say that lessons from the French masters of the academic world were certainly less important for this new generation of artists who choose their reference among modernist masters. For Zhu Dejun, it was Nicolas de Staël, and for Zhao Wuji, Paul Klee. Zhu Dejun discovered de Staël at the big exhibition organized just after the artist passed away in 1955. And for Zhao Wuji, he saw for the first time original paintings by Paul Klee in a museum in Switzerland in the early 50s, and he even acquired a small painting of Klee in a gallery. Galleries were actually important places for the development of an artist network. When Zhao Wuji was enrolled by the gallerist Pierre Loeb, he joined a group of international artists that shared interest in developing new ways in the field of abstract painting. The strategy of the galleries was certainly efficient, and other young artists of the gallery like Jean-Paul Riopel or Georges Mathieu began to be recognized in the same time as Zhao Wuji, and they remained close for their whole life. During the same period of the early 50s, Wallerstein exhibited for the first time in Paris as the Studio Facchetti. This gallery was open to many foreign talents, Typically, it was the first gallery to exhibit Johnson Pollock in France, just 1 year before Wallerstein. During the same period, faculty also exhibited Karel Appel, who remained, like other painters from the Cobra group, very close from Wallerstein. And they often developed collective projects together. So here they are in New York a few years later. So the question of working together brings us back to the artist studios. Beside the shared spaces of the art academies, other important places of encounters were the printing studios. This exhibition poster mentions the display of 8 lithographs by Zhao Wuqi, commented by the poet Henri Michaud, and it's the result of the meeting of the painter and the poet through the printing studio of Edmond Desjobert, located in Montparnasse. Zhao Wuqi was freshly arrived in Paris, and he tried for the first time to produce lithographs at the studio of Edmond Desjobert, who had been working with many major artists since the 1930s. The editor and friend of Henri Michaud, Robert Godet, saw the lithographs and showed them to the poet, who decided at once to write about them. This is an example of the way printing studios like Desjobert or Atelier 17 played an important role for the development of unexpected artistic networks. Of course, a meeting like the one of Zhao Wuqi and Henri Michaud was made possible by the personal interest of Michaud for China, which he visited during his youth. And later on, Michaud wrote on the Chinese script and calligraphy. And as a painter, he also considered ink as one of his favorite media. Another example, the Baudet printing workshop in Belleville was another place for interactive production. Wallerstein worked there with Pierre Alechinsky and others, and it inspired them a group show in which Ting and Alechinsky would work together as musicians during a performance. And among the many collaborations developed within this network of artists, the works by Alechinsky and Ting have a special place. For the first time in the early 1960s, the poet Christian d'Autremont, considering a series of paintings co-produced by Alechinsky and Ting, discovered that the author of the painting were not Alechinsky nor Ting, but a third virtual artist that he called Aleching. So for d'Autremont, 1 + 1 is 3. And Aleching's personality as an artist is more than Alechinsky and Ting. D'Autremont also added that both artists are masters that make themselves the student of the author. This is a very important statement, I believe, very characteristic of the post-war period, a time during which many European and American artists were interested in Asian art, its aesthetics and practices. And for instance, Alechinsky went to Japan to realize a documentary on calligraphy, and d'Autremont himself was inspired by Asian calligraphy in its own creation. But Mark Tobey could also be mentioned here. Before the war, many Asian artists went to French art academies and museums to study. But after the war, many of them just joined Paris to establish themselves on this artistic stage. Interestingly, some of them, like the Korean painter Lee Hong-no, became famous in France not only as an artist, but also as a professor. His teaching influenced a whole generation of young French artists and intellectuals. In 1964, he founded his own academy, the Academy of Oriental Painting, and he was invited to teach at the Cernuschi Museum, which was something completely new in this time. I wanted to mention this major figure of modern Korean painting here, also because among the founding fathers and supporters of Liang No's academies of Oriental painting were artists coming from different Asian countries. Fujita from Japan, Mai Tu from Vietnam, and Zhao Wuti from China. But among the supporters were also European artists like Hans Hartung or Pierre Soulages. And this is a very rare example of interaction between artists of different cultures and generations, also very significant of the post-war period networks. And finally, I would like to introduce the third generation of Chinese artists in France. These artists were born after the war in the late 40s and 50s. They started their career in the late 1970s and early 80s in a time when the opening policy allowed the blossoming of many avant-garde movements, very diverse in their content and techniques of expression. Ma Desheng and Wang Keping were members of the Stars group. Huang Yongping was the leading figure of Xiamen Dada. And Shen Yuan, like many other artists, was a participant of the China Avant-Garde exhibition. Wang Keping and Ma Desheng were among the first to come to France, where they continued their very personal artistic practice. Sculpture for Wang Keping, poetry and painting for Ma Desheng. An important exhibition organized in Paris in 1989, the Magician of Earth, intended to open the field of contemporary art and consider it from multicultural perspectives. Among the three artists from China invited to join the show were Huang Yongping and Yang Tiechang, who later on developed respectively their installation, painting, and calligraphy practices between France, China, and other countries. The Magician of Earth exhibition was curated by Jean-Hubert Martin, director of the National Museum of Modern Art, who selected the artists in China. But next year, an exhibition without walls, curated by Fei Wei, was organized in a small village in southern France. The exhibition gathered Huang Yongping and Yang Tiechang, and they were joined by the French-based Chen Zhen and Yan Peiming, not to forget important artists Gu Wenda and Cai Guoqiang. And the project had the support of the French Ministry of Culture. So this exhibition was both artistically ambitious, full of the energy of an experimental project, and in the same time inscribed in the official frame of the French Ministry of Culture, which means that the artists and curators benefited from the recent connections they established in this country. Only 10 years later, Huang Yongping was selected as one of the two representatives of France in Venice Biennale with Jean-Pierre Bertrand. His project, One Man, Nine Animals, which was challenging the classical architecture of the French pavilion, was later acquired by the French state. This is, of course, an evidence of the recognition of Huang Yongping on the international and national art scene. It is also interesting to notice that Ho Hanru, who was one of the curators of the exhibition, was one of the curators of this exhibition. And this is the difference between the earlier generation of artists, is that this generation also had a prominent independent curators among them, Ho Hanru and Fei Wei. And this certainly helped to develop a network in France and abroad. Interestingly, during the same years of the last 20 years and early 21st century, the most prominent representative of the second generation of Chinese painters, Zhu Detun and Zhao Wuti, were elected at the French Academy of Fine Arts. This official recognition was the consequence of their long and successful career, but also of a broad network of relationship inside and even outside the art world. To come back to the third generation of Chinese artists, we can see that between the last 15 years, they managed to find a place for themselves at the center of the Paris art stage. For instance, in the Louvre, when Yan Peiming was invited to exhibit his paintings inspired by Mona Lisa, or in the Grand Palais, when Huang Yongping developed his visions of empires for the 2016 edition of Monumenta. So you see, this is only an outline, and it would require more time to investigate how new networks allowed the success of those ambitious projects in the same museum and exhibition spaces where artists from earlier generations copied the masters and exhibited in salons. To conclude, I would like to thank again the National Gallery of Singapore for this beautiful and meaningful City of Authors exhibition, which truly enabled us to dive into the Paris of the Asian artists of the early 20th century, providing both elements of context and clues to understand their artworks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. That is really in-depth, very comprehensive presentation. And just now we have better understanding about different kind of networks, right? And maybe we can describe some as like vertical, like for example, between the French mentor and their Chinese students, right? Sauveur and Wu Guanzhong, for example. And some are horizontal, like, such as like Zhao Qi and his friends from the School of Paris, right? Across different countries, different culture. So this actually came to, if we look at from the broader perspective, which I've been thinking for a while, since joining the team for the City of Others exhibition, whether it's possible to look at from the broader perspective, think about the intentions and dynamics between the different sites. For example, Shanghai, even Hangzhou, and Singapore and Paris. Like Singapore actually is often served as kind of transit port for those artists. Right? Some of them even stop here for a while, like Liu Haisu, Xu Beihong, Si Tuqiao, and some later settled here permanently, like Liu Kang and Georgia. So is it got any possibility we can look at the dynamics of these sites as like interconnected artistic sites? And would you like to share some of your thoughts on that?
Yes, of course, we have been focusing on Paris, so as a center, but it's impossible to understand the dynamics of the modern movements or within this period without considering that it is connected to many other centers. And I think for Asia, for instance, if we don't see the dynamics between Shanghai, Guangdong, and Japan, Tokyo, we can't understand the later development of the movement because so many of the Chinese artists, they have been studying in Japan before going to Europe and to Paris. So this is an example. The second one, you mentioned the travel, because now that we use the airplane and we can go from Asia to Europe within 10 hours, we tend to forget that in this time you needed at least 1 month, so by boat and with several stops. And it was quite an experience for those artists, especially when they were young and were going to Europe for the first time. And I think that every stop can be very significant. In Vietnam, some of them stopped to see the museums. And later on, there was also Hong Kong, here Singapore. And so this was also very, very important. If we look carefully, we can realize that those artists, they had local networks in all those places, including Singapore. So Zhao Wuti had a local network here. And so this is very, very important. And the first and second generation, they both share this experience of going to Europe by boat, so slowly. And so this is, for instance, of a few centers interconnected in Asia, but we could say the same for Europe, because it was not only Paris, but important artists like Ling Fengmian, Xu Beihong, they all spent times in Berlin. And of course, Berlin is a very important center during this time. And when it came to the time for them to come back to Europe as curators, just like Xu Beihong in the 1930s, he did not only organize a show for Paris. His exhibition was a traveling exhibition that has to come from Western Europe to Eastern Europe and finally finish in Moscow. So it was clear for him that there were different centers interconnected, and that Chinese modern painting had to be there.
Okay, so from what you share with us, will we like possible to consider at the time with this kind of international traveling, as you said, come to the south to Singapore and also Tokyo and Paris, actually it's helped the artists to reshape about their experiences, like to looking at the multiple sites as their center for artistic activities, instead like only looking at like Tokyo or Paris as kind of center, but it's more as like democratic flat structure for their experiences and creative dialogues.
Yes, maybe we tend to look closely at the places which are famous for modern and contemporary art. But it was also, in the same time, artists, they also wanted to experience and learn about European culture and history of art. And so many of them also were interested just to do the classical grand tour and go into Italy, go into Rome. Rome was so important for the students' trained at the French Academy, because the great prizes of Rome was allowed the winners to go in the city. And this is, of course, very, very important, and was still very important, I think, for the first generation of artists.
Thank you. I think we should open the floor for more questions and discussion, especially we did mention about Singapore's involvement in this mapping. Yeah. The first question, we are looking for the questions from the audiences.
Thanks, Eric, for your presentation. I just have a question regarding the first and the second generation of Chinese artists that you mentioned. In the second generation, you had shared that there seemed to be a kind of closer interaction between the French artists and the Chinese artists. And the French artists were quite curious or interested in what the Chinese artists were doing, and you could see that the influence of Chinese calligraphy was kind of picked up by the French artists. So I'm quite curious, for the first generation, did you also see that there was a similar curiosity between the French artists and the Chinese artists of that period?
I think there were maybe different attitudes according to the age. For instance, the professors, they often professed a deep respect for the Chinese traditions, because exhibitions of Chinese painting, classical Chinese paintings, they started earlier in the century. For instance, Cernuschi Museum, the Guimet Museum, the Louvre, they already organized classical Chinese paintings exhibitions. in the early 20th century. So the generation of the professors of Xu Beihong and Lin Fengmian, they had this respect for Chinese tradition. They often said to them, if when you can rely on your own tradition, and if you come back to China, you have to rely on your own tradition to develop your own way. But they did not follow this way personally, maybe because of the age. Because, for instance, André Clodo, who was much younger, when he followed Lin Fengmian to Beijing and then to Hangzhou, he also in Beijing he met Qi Baishi, and in Hangzhou he started to try to use ink painting. So they were already artists interested in this, but it was not, I think, as common as it became after the war.
So some Chinese specialists here. Anyone would like to,
Sorry, I had a question. At the beginning of the lecture, you asked who might be the others in a city of others. And one way I had thought about it was that they were Chinese immigrants in perhaps a city that was foreign to them. But from what you have shared, they appeared to have maybe gained the respect and recognition that they might not have gotten back home, such that the others might be, people who didn't seem to appreciate what they could bring. Would that be a valid way of looking at it, or is that perhaps too idealistic of their experience in Paris?
Not sure that I understand the question.
Can you simplify the question?
So I just wanted to, from what you have shared, it appears that they have gotten recognition in Paris that they may not have gotten wherever they came from. Would that be accurate in what I feel they got in Paris, or was there perhaps a lot more struggle in getting to their status, at the end of their careers or even during their careers? Was it hard for them to integrate in society? Did they face a lot of pushback, for example?
I think that the salon system was finally quite open. So it was not that difficult to exhibit in this period. Maybe it was maybe even easier than it can be today for a young artist coming from abroad. So this system was quite open. It was easier to enter, but maybe difficult to progress within the system to get a deep recognition from the local audience. So this is also, we have the feeling that when Pai Liang, for instance, is keeping on exhibiting in salon for a whole career, including the 50s and the 60s, she maybe is not in the right place, in the right moment, because we see that younger artists like Wallace Ting or Zhao Wuti are in galleries which can promote that art much better. That maybe is the problem. They are not exhibiting in the right place, in the right moment. And also something is due with their own personal way of art. I think they maybe, Pai Liang has been a professor when she was in China, and maybe she did not consider her work as a commercial product. And so maybe she was more interested in just exhibiting in salons, and she didn't have, like maybe many artists have today, she didn't have a commercial strategy for sure.
It was actually a follow-up question to what you were just discussing, because it's so remarkable in your presentation to see how well some of the artists of the second generation could penetrate the gallery system and kind of make a much bigger sort of public recognition for their careers. And even in the 30s and 20s, there were certain migrant artists who also, foreign artists, who were also able to get commercial representation and launch their careers very well, Fujita, Wilfredo Lam, even in the late 30s. So I was wondering, why do you think it was that the first generation of Chinese artists didn't really do this, that there was such a difference in the circulation of their work compared to the second generation? Was it because the communities and the artists themselves behaved differently, or had the art world changed to some extent between those two generations?
I think Chinese artists of the first generation, they also had opportunities. And San Yu, he really had opportunities. He was already exhibited by an important gallery, and I think he did 2 exhibitions. But then the relationship with the owner of the gallery, he couldn't support that anymore, and so he decided to choose another way. But I think there were no special problems for Chinese artists. Just like this opportunity was not achieved by him, and some of them, like Xu Beihong, he expressed in some articles his distance for the gallery system. He considered that this commercial system is not really accurate for an artist to develop properly his art. I'm not sure that this opinion was shared by the others.
Okay, great. I think Ari has shared a lot with us, and we will continue the dialogue.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's always hard to moderate a roundtable. And first of all, let me echo the congratulations of many on the successful exhibition, City of Others. So this is the entire curatorial team, and we salute your efforts for this groundbreaking exhibition. My thoughts, the prompts that I have for the roundtable are organized around 2 main concerns, and they derive from the title of the exhibition, City of Others. So the first one has something to do with like displacing the city, which is Paris. No? To displace the city, which is Paris, and also to reclaim otherness. To reclaim otherness and to displace Paris. The city has become a dominant agency in the presentations. It's animating, it's also liberating. It does so many things to the artists, right? So tends to over-determine the discourse, and as it's seen as like a privileged cosmopolis, but at the same time a contested migrant contact zone. So it's a complex place. And so we appreciate the efforts of the curators to disperse the dominance of the city through some monographic approaches, right? So there's an effort to efforts at individuation. That there are like, people or artists with specific practices. So that's one. But there's also an effort to see them as a collective. Yeah. So on the one hand, there's individuation. On the other hand, there's an effort to like collectivize them. So in the same case of like the Harlem Renaissance, right? There's this like a movement, and in the case of the exhibition, there is like Asian artists, right? So so there is this tension between the monographic treatment and also the effort to collectivize these artists in a particular place at a particular period. So I don't know if I have a question really, but but these are thoughts in my mind, and I see some like possible trajectories that have been proposed in the presentation. One is to go beyond the art world. I think was quite strong. this effort to go beyond the art world, to look at like a public sphere. That the artists were not just confined to the art world, that they are part of a larger public sphere. They were like activists, for instance, or they took part in certain activities, political activities. They were also workers, so they were part of the workforce, labor force in Paris, and they were surveilled too, right? In the case of the Vietnamese lacquer workers, and they were in the and in the presentation of Eric, we see that the Asian artists were also institution builders, right? And they also initiated certain things, like some kind of counter structures within a dominant sphere. So that's one. And then the other trajectory would be the one offered by Inaga Sensei of the cross-cultural history, and also an intergenerational history offered by Eric. I think this is some important points to also consider as we move away from the linear, right, the linear logic of the art history we know. So Inaga Sensei talks of the spiral, right, which is quite breathtaking as when you listen to him in terms of the intense relationality of things, right? And also the imbrication is quite amazing. And in the context of the public sphere, we also saw in the presentation of Eric the network of shared spaces, like how the studio or the academy or the workshop became sites of collaboration. I think this was also echoed by the presentation of women when she mapped out the places where the artists went in Paris. So I think there's and I might also suggest that, and this was already intimated by Phoebe, that this dynamic interaction of the place of migration and the place of origin, I think that has to be, enhanced. This dynamic interaction between the place of origin and the place of migration, and then the transit zones as intimated by Cai Heng, like Singapore, for instance, the in-between spaces. I think this movement has to be foregrounded more. So I think that's one. The first concern is to displace the city of Paris. So maybe some thoughts from the curators, like maybe where you were thinking of also when you were doing this, to repeat the centrality of Paris, right? So was that some kind of anxiety that you had to negotiate or navigate? Just curious. Yeah.
I think I better take that one. I mean, of course, I think this was a very strong anxiety that we had about repeating the centrality of Paris by having this exhibition. But I think something that I mentioned in my presentation and that was conscious for all of us is that we were curating this exhibition here in Singapore inside a museum which has a well-established set of permanent galleries that deal with the regional histories of modernism on their own terms. And I think in some ways, and it's something that we consider as we think now about how the show might travel, it sort of should not have been curated from a position other than that. You know, this is a museum that's now had almost 10 years of those permanent galleries being in place. So for us at this moment, it was a way of kind of reaching towards a center that had already been very overdetermined by art history. So I think one of the things that we could really feel is that we weren't inventing the idea of the centrality of Paris. In some ways, we were trying to grapple with it and to really look at what its function was for artists. You know, sometimes if you look at sort of art history monographs on an artist, they'll kind of mention a Paris period or mention in passing an artist's time in Paris without being precise about exactly what it was that they were engaging with in Paris. And sometimes there's this assumption that the product of being in Paris is French influence, or the product of being in Paris is getting the latest information about the avant-garde. But I think what we wanted to do is displace some of those assumptions by having a more precise understanding of how that city actually functioned, what the specific engagements of artists from Asia were in that city. But I think Patrick's point about the dynamics of the countries of origin, and a point made by all of the presenters today, is quite well taken. And obviously, we kind of had to defer that discussion to our permanent galleries in a way. Although we do have some intimations of it in the show, you know, where there's occasionally works that the artists made immediately on their return. We also tried to be quite clear about the fact that the artists were bringing something into the Paris art world. And you know, they could use skills that they already had, or they sort of played into certain kind of expectations of the reception of that art world too, and that was based on their own training. Another quite sort of troubling problem for us, which Patrick also intimated, is to do with the idea of Asia. And obviously this kind of blanket Asian artists in Paris is a very flattening idea. And one of the things that we can see through the exhibition is quite distinct trajectories, also from Eric and Inaga-san's presentations today, that there are very distinctive trajectories from different parts of Asia. Unlike the Harlem Renaissance, where there's much more sort of direct interaction between artists who knew and recognized one another as being part of the same community, we could ask, is that really true of so-called Asian artists in Paris? And I think we sort of struggled a bit with this, but we felt that to a certain extent it was made true in that context. Because even if those artists didn't kind of think of themselves as Asian per se, they came to a city that had a perception of Asia as a category, and of Asian art as a category. So in some ways that sort of interaction was a factor in what they produced in Paris, because it was a factor of the reception context. And interestingly, this was also sort of became apparent as we researched some of the interactions between different groups of artists from different parts of Asia. So we can see, for instance, in the gallery where we present some of the archives related to Liu Kang and Liu Haisu, how their Paris careers were also covered in a Japanese language magazine of the same period. We can see that many artists from different parts of Asia looked towards Fujita as a benchmark for how to navigate their Paris careers and kind of commented on that. So there was some sort of mutual recognition even for artists who weren't kind of really participating directly with one another in the same community.
I may just add very quickly. I mean, whilst researching on this show, and I'm just going to be a bit frank here, just thinking also about Southeast Asian representation, I'm just building off Patrick's point about the fact that there's an effort to see Asian artists as a collective, but obviously, you know, it's hard to avoid the fact that Asian artists are not a monolith, and you know that these imbalances in representation. Just thinking also about some of the Southeast Asian artists who are very prominent in Paris, but unfortunately, because it's beyond the time frame that we are looking in interwar Paris from the 1920s to 40s. I mean, some artists like Mokhtar Arpin and Vincente Manansala, Nina Sergio and Salim, right? These were some artists that we explored also during our curatorial research that eventually we just had to sort of exclude because they actually kind of gained prominence more in the late 40s to 60s. Yeah.
Yeah, or actually, I mean, Salim is a really sad case of for the show, I mean, not in general, but he was an artist who was active very early and actually through many of the decades of the period of the exhibition in Paris, but his extant work from that time is, from what we could see, completely unlocatable, so we kind of weren't able to represent him in the exhibition.
But yeah, in light of that limit, Phoebe, did you reconsider shifting the timeline? I mean, yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, we
post-war.
We did.
Mm-hmm.
So we considered it, but we also felt that actually to deal with this subject, we really needed to also be able to offer a much deeper kind of contextual understanding of Paris. And we felt that if we'd taken this kind of very long trajectory of Paris, like into the 60s or even beyond, we risked having a very survey-like show that would kind of end up being very superficial about the specific periods. There were also some other reasons why we thought this interwar period was particularly critical, and it was to do with the discourses about foreignness and migrantness that were active in Paris at that time, in which kind of the idea of the foreign or the idea of the non-French were kind of becoming especially loaded. So there was sort of an interesting moment to look at the dynamic of the migrant artist. And especially the fact that the term École de Paris, School of Paris, is coined at this time specifically to describe the large presence of migrant artists in Paris at the time. So it's sort of also to do with thinking about, at what point a sort of site of reception becomes kind of particularly dense for a community.
I have a question for Lisa. Just curious if there was like a perceived Japanese ascendancy in the reception to Western art within Asia. Ascendancy in terms of like it was almost like contemporaneous with the West. Unlike in other parts where there was marked belatedness.
Yeah, I work primarily on the works by Japanese artists for the exhibition, and I think I struggle with constantly I was thinking about the uneasiness of placing Japan even within what we call Asia, right? I mean, as Japanese, like when you use the term Asia in Japan, Japan is actually not included. It's referring to the rest of Asia. So it's kind of, this mentality is very much ingrained even in its language, right? And I think it has it's really like loaded with colonial and, history and the Japanese background as an empire, right? But even so, to me, this exhibition gave me an opportunity to also orient Japanese art just because of this perceived maybe ascendancy, which is not even being aware by many Japanese art historians, not Inaga sensei, but the majority of the public and art historical research that's being done. So as we were developing this exhibition, I think I was kind of constantly thinking of the past exhibitions that's been done under the framework of, like Cubism in Asia, Realism in Asia, and how are we approaching the Asian, framework differently by more kind of ground up, sort of the acute, sort of heavier placement on the shared time space by artists coming from various parts of Asia, including Japan. Yeah. So rather than kind of trying to fit like a stylistic tendency, Cubism in Asia or, realism in Asia, how can we kind of overcome that framework by looking at it from more specific context? Yeah, trying to build that bridge.
Would you like to add, Cai Heng? No? I'm not putting everyone on the spot, but if you'd add.
I can maybe add to that and respond also to Patrick, your earlier point about thinking through the city and how, what Lisa just brought up, this idea of styles actually has been the predominant way in which Paris has actually been discussed. So the kind of almost linear presumption of progression of artistic styles across time. And Paris as a city, actually from our reading, was kind of presumed as this backdrop. So in talking through how we wanted to organize the exhibition, actually tracing sites rather than styles was for us quite productive in terms of just thinking through like what were the artists' orbits and what came out of those orbits, rather than presuming or grouping them according to styles or adherence to certain schools even. So if you look at the last gallery, which looks at Montparnasse, there is actually an incredible diversity of styles that are blossoming in that room. And there are then so many more interesting possibilities to ask the question of why. Why were there so many distinct styles that Asian artists were engaging with? Not just their different countries of origin, but the different sites that they were attracted to and the different sites in which they exhibited all come into play.
Thank you. My second concern is something to do with the reclaiming of otherness. And here I'm interested in the sources of artistic subjectivity. Yeah, and which largely pertain to tradition and also to tutelage. The citation of both, the citation of tradition and tutelage, and also the distancing from tradition and tutelage. I think that was the dynamic. No? It was not like one way, right? So the challenge and maybe the pressure for the Asian artist, maybe in Paris, was to, well, there was a pressure to learn, right, and to know. So there was an unconscious of mastery somehow, I feel. But there was also a pressure to be different, right? So to demonstrate idiosyncrasy, right, within the validating Western pedagogy, right? And also the pedagogy of the tradition back home, right? So my question is, as curators, were you interested in that break? Or at least this identification, right, with tradition or tutelage, some kind of a foil to like total assimilation or absorption into one or the other. So I can see some aspects of that, maybe in terms of materiality, like the investment in lacquer, silk, even baby powder, right? Baby powder. So there's also in the presentation of Inaga Sensei, we saw quite brisk reciprocal translations, right? That Asian artists and European artists mutually translated, right, each other. And I don't know, but maybe gender could be an articulated break. Just my feeling. So yes, I just wanted this, question of a break as a way to reclaim otherness. Yeah.
For me personally, I don't know if the other curators agree, but we really tried to look at agency as the way to reclaim this kind of idea of otherness. Otherness was a kind of projection. It's an aspect of the reception context. So I think more than an aspect of kind of tensions between tutelage and tradition, I would say kind of agency in navigating a reception environment, which I think Inaga Sensei put it very well, that there was a kind of very narrow band that such artists could occupy. The path of kind of too much imitation or too much tutelage was considered very poor. Similarly, they wanted to break from tradition and do something innovative, not purely rely on something that they'd already learned elsewhere. So that kind of left a sort of very narrow channel of space they could occupy. But I should add that this was largely only relevant to artists who were especially interested in their success in Paris or in their career in Paris, which wasn't necessarily all of the artists that we looked at. If Paris was a kind of stopping point in which they pursued a certain kind of pedagogical interest or network interest and then moved on elsewhere, then this wasn't so important. So for those artists who came to Paris specifically because they wanted to pick up a certain kind of academic training and take it back to their country of origin, at which point they would choose to discard it or not, this kind of narrow band of audience expectation is not so critical. So I think for us, we gave kind of the artists the benefit of assuming their agency in navigating that. So for instance, the case that I probably know most intimately is the Vietnamese artists who, as they migrated to Paris in the late 1930s, chose to focus their practice so much more specifically on the kind of painting in silk that was very romantic, kind of picked up aspects of School of Paris, picked up aspects of kind of an earlier aspect of Western art, like the Dutch painting or pre-Renaissance painting, and then integrated it into the Vietnamese aesthetic of silk. It was a creative choice for them, but also very useful in positioning them in the sort of reception context of Paris and the market. So to me, it wasn't a question of tradition or tutelage. They were using bits and pieces of both of those things, but it was kind of about having an agency to channel the work in this direction.
Regarding about the tradition things, I would like to share a little bit about the materials we saw and a lot of active dialogue between artists like Chang Shu-hong with his mentors, checking about the show in 1933, how the French scholars or painters looking at the tradition. So in that, maybe it's still too simple. We say, okay, from the other culture, they can have distant view. Actually, at that time, those scholars, sinologists, like Bing Yang, even we talk about English word like Roger Fry, all those, they actually quite actively involved into the discussion and redefinition of notion of Chinese art. So for example, 6 principles. So it's become kind of key ideas circulated among those knowledge scholars and artists redefine the notion of tradition, at least for the Chinese examples. Yeah, so it's really in kind of global mapping for these ideas for some of the Chinese artists with this kind of understanding. It's not still singular, okay, from other tradition looking at. It's become multiple involvement, multiple dialogues to looking at that concept. Yeah.
Maybe Roy, you think photography, the theory of photography helps you in conceptualizing this reclaiming of otherness, because photography is quite within that this discourse or problematic of self and other, right?
I'm drawn to the idea of tradition and tutelage, as you mentioned, but also I feel like it also sits within a similar category or aligns with objectivity and convention of photography, and how a lot of our research and the archives that we've drawn, the archival photos that we've drawn, really dismantles the illusion of photographic objectivity by both revealing how photography was complicit in staging empire and manufacturing this authenticity and also a kind of difference, and really translating cultural identity into this legible and consumable set of signs, for Western audiences. But at the same time, the camera is not a neutral recorder, but also an active sort of participant in shaping these colonial fantasies. So even within the photographs themselves, there is already a kind of ambiguity or ambivalence that takes place. I don't want to go down the whole rabbit hole of Homi Bhabha, of course, but yeah, the idea of mimicry, slippage, the instability of photography as a medium, and allowing for these moments of subversion and resistance, even if ever so slightly, these sparks of contingencies, as I like to quote Roland Barthes, and just also thinking about photography as setting the stage for more slippage through the form of painting, for the case of Wilfredo Lam and Emeritus Sergio, right? This discourse, intermedia discourse between different artists and the primitivism and also the counter-primitivism strategies of each artist and their respective forms of self-fashioning. So the fluidity really carries through, not just across the lineage of practices, but also in the medium itself. Yeah.
I think just on that note on photography, I'm thinking about the fascinating set of photographs taken by M. Cloche that we found in our library and archive, which are depicting the 1931 International Colonial Exposition. And instead of these kind of just very flat, planar perspective views, there are these really dramatic close-ups and sometimes quite whimsical views of the International Colonial Exposition. I mean, one little in-joke that we had was this one distant view of the Khmer Angkor Wat temple, and there's like a little frog in the middle, just in the foreground, a toad in focus. And the photo, it's up in the exhibition, and it's still titled, the Indochina Pavilion. And even from that view, from this French photographer who was actually a very famous film director, we later found out, it's kind of disrupting, in a way, that kind of, enormous scale of the exposition just from this perspective. So I think there's so many layers through which to read kind of photographic representations as well.
And also the fact that, one of the things we tried to do in the show is show a lot of archives of how artists presented themselves in their Paris period.
So before I open the floor for more questions from the audience, maybe just say one more question. We are all trained here as art historians, and did you feel like a tension between the training of art history and the method of curating a show like this? Because, certain situations present, right, opportunities to also challenge the discipline in which we were trained. So do you think exhibition like Asian artists in Paris presented like this tension between like art historical method and the curatorial method, based on your experience?
This show, maybe not. I think this is quite an art historically grounded show because it has a kind of research base that is really grounded in a specific lateral art history. But I think the opportunity that curating it as an exhibition presents is to kind of make the argument visually and sort of physically in the experience of the space. So I feel like in some ways, some of the things the objects that resonate with one another or the connections that emerge from City of Others might not be as convincing in a kind of textual art historical form, but are quite convincing in a visual form, in the experience of seeing them together. So I would say that was the opportunity it presented. But in terms of methodology, I think we kind of still stayed in a fairly classical arena. I don't know if my fellow curators would disagree.
So yeah, please, from the audience, this is a good opportunity for all of us to ask the curators questions after we've seen the show. If you have some things in your mind, this is the good moment to raise them.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I worked on this show as well, and I really enjoyed the show, especially looking through all the works. So my question is rooted in the fact that the show, as you mentioned, is very rooted in art history and academia. But how would this show be best approached by for example, the layman. Because I appreciate the show because I love art history, a bit of a nerd, and I enjoy looking at the range of works. And like, it is important to understand the history to really truly appreciate the value of each work and the works and the artists existing together in the same space. But this may not be the usual approach or the most accessible approach for like the general audience which enters the museum, enters the gallery. How would you kind of pitch or like direct the layman or like the general audience to experience the show, maybe in addition to aesthetically, or like how could it be value adding to the everyday person? Yeah, hopefully it's not too convoluted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for all your kind efforts in helping us put together this show. Ali is from our artwork and exhibition management team. Would anyone like to?
Yeah, I actually have a kind of instinctive response to that, which is really through the lens of the other. And I think, while we were putting this show together, we kept having these discussions about how prescient some of the ideas that the show brings forth from a historical perspective are to today's contemporary concerns. The idea of foreignness, otherness, emplacement, belonging, travel, circulation, reception are things that continue to be really pressing to artists today, traveling and presenting in a contemporary context, but I think also from a very lived experience of how we are observing the world. Yeah.
I actually think it's not sorry, am I biased, but not a challenging or difficult exhibition because there's so much diversity in the type of materials that are being presented, right? From design, from crafts to, colonial exposition, immersive sort of spatial presentation of that, and dance. And just kind of connecting that to Patrick's earlier question about how my training in art history or as an art historian, how did I approach this exhibition? Maybe some areas that I struggled with or had to cope with was really the daringness in entering into writings and historical writings or texts relating to areas that are other than visual art. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the unusual things that we weren't expecting to put in the exhibition, but we ended up doing in a way because of the way the research develops, which was the section on dance. So that was never part of the original conception of the show, but because of the way our research emerged and some of the kind of cross currents between visual art and dance and the very rich archives that we encountered during the process, as well as something Patrick mentioned about wanting to kind of at least gesture to the fact that there's a broader public sphere outside the visual arts. Even as curators, I think we know that. So that ended up in the exhibition space as well.
Also, I just want to thank Patrick for your comment in the middle of working on this show, also to include more multimedia elements. So we've also done that with regards to, for example, the Palais de la Porte Dorée. We have these close-up shots, of the Museum of Immigration, both the interior and exteriors, and you can really see the very intricate bas reliefs. And you can also maybe draw a comparison with if you've been to Angkor Wat before, those bas reliefs that you see in Angkor Wat. And again, the kind of motifs that are being repeated and used, to create this and stage this imperial fantasy that you see within the building. And we've paired it with the archival footage from the Institut National de l'Audiovisuel, the archives from France, and also, multiple other videos that, AEM has also very kindly helped to also set things up, just to bring it back to you again, Ali. But thank you so much for your question. Yeah, that's something that we will continue to chew on for our other shows.
Thank you so much for this exhibition, and I also enjoy all the sections in this exhibition. But my question is, I think this is a very informative kind of exhibition. So my question is, in this age of information overload, what are the one thing or two things from the perspective of curators you want visitors to remember when they leave the exhibition?
Like the visitor takeaway points from the exhibition. Okay, I'll have a go. I mean, I think what Hui Min said earlier is very meaningful, that there are aspects of this exhibition that are still really important today. And in fact, when we started working on this show some years ago, I don't think we envisaged how critical and tense those same issues would be now. So things about who belongs where in a city, in a place. I mean, that is pressing like never before. The ideas of kind of what it means to belong in multiple places in the world. This is something so pressing today. So I think what I really hope that viewers can understand from this exhibition is that this is not an arid exercise only about the past. The way that we understand this past has some implication for the way that we understand how we should behave to one another in the world today. You know, the idea that our spaces contain diversity, contain multitudes, and they always have. I think if there's something I'd really like visitors to take away from this show, it would be that.
Thank you for the symposium and the beautiful exhibition. I've just got two questions. One, your recent comment about the takeaway. And you're right about what's happening in the world today with closing of national borders, right? And we are eschewing globalization and all of that. But what would be the city of others today? Right? So, and the second question is when you were doing this exhibition, and I loved the fact that you brought in the lacquer and all, because for me, that showed not only a Eurocentric vision of what the Asian artists learned from Paris or from the West and how they imitated the Western artists, but I thought what would have even enriched this show more was if we could show how Van Gogh or Cézanne or Matisse actually they learned from Asia and what were the parallels there. So that, to me, I think it was not only a one-way that, okay, Asian artists in Paris and what have they shown and how has their work and identity changed. Because they changed, Asian art also changed Western art. And so just those two comments.
Anyone? So what is the city of others today? And the second one, I think you heard quite well, yeah.
Maybe I'll take the second one first, because I think that's a really important point. And we did try to show how in the period that we were looking at specifically as well, that there was kind of appropriation of Asian aesthetics across Art Deco, which is why we have things like the Cartier and some of the fashion design. I feel that idea that there was already a kind of internalization of aspects of Asian art within the modern trajectory is really important. And it was something that modern Asian artists knew as well and recognized. So for instance, I think Inaga Sensei mentioned it in some of the Japanese art criticism, that they were well aware that Van Gogh had looked at Japanese prints, etc. And certainly in my own reading of the Vietnamese sources, they knew that too. You know, they would sometimes say things like, post-impressionism is actually already an Asian style. So this is a very meaningful concept when we think of this, so-called Western influence, because actually these artists always recognize the kind of complex heritage of those styles. But I have to say, I think it's a different show. It's another show. A very interesting idea, but maybe another show. What is the city of others today? Maybe I don't want to answer. Like, maybe it's just a question we can take to ourselves.
Maybe it's not something to define, but like it's just to deconstruct, and that's precisely the kind of dislocation that we are talking about, right? Paris is a site of convergence, but at the same time, there is this dislocation, and also, and the point is really not to present these seamless narratives, but rather to kind of surface the kind of discontinuities, and hopefully maybe, it could even sort of have implications on other cities, as we think about.
Maybe the Venice Biennale last year has this proposition of foreigners everywhere, right? Could be a clue to a curatorial thinking in the present.
Yeah, I just have a question, kind of related to what Phoebe mentioned just now. Because if you think about this, that period between 1920s and 40s, that is quite contentious. And there are definitely a lot of issues that when we look back at that period right now, we have a totally different take on that. Now, as curators, how then do you approach that? I mean, when it comes to certain issues like colonialism, and you start to see certain injustices happening, how do you decide not to extrapolate or insert your own bias into the show? How do you choose to hold back too much of messaging and just to let the work from that period speak for itself? Or did you have to do much of reframing?
We did some, precisely because of the matters that you allude to. And I think that's necessary because every time you curate a show, you're putting it out to the public now. And you're saying, we need to address, we need to be looking at this now, we need to be understanding this now. So I don't think you can just reiterate the kind of problematic material that the period produces and then say, well, that's what was produced. So I think we did a certain amount of kind of thinking about what should be presented now, while still trying to present a history that was accurate. So you'll see in the exhibition there are aspects about racial hierarchy, there are aspects about colonialism, and we don't want to pretend that those things didn't exist. They must be acknowledged. But I think how we present them is also something we have to carefully consider. And I have to say, I don't know if we always made the right choices about that. That's really difficult to say. One of the things for me was the presentation of the colonial exposition, which is obviously very troubling, to look at now. It's a very racist idea, and yet at the same time it was presented in a very kind of overwhelmingly aesthetic, and in some cases the art is, quite compellingly beautiful, which makes it even more seductive, even more problematic, So presenting that again in an exhibition is difficult. So you can see in that section we have a whole wall of reproduced archives that show the anti-colonial movement as it also existed at that time, to make sure the visitor can understand that it was contested even in its own period. And I think that's how we try to situate it, by showing that, this is not a given, it's not something that passed uncontested, certainly not now, but not even then. So I think, there's a certain amount of framing that we wanted to put in to kind of convey that. But it's a very useful question, thank you. Would anyone like to add to that?
Hi, I'd like to join everyone in thanking you all and congratulating you all for the exhibition and for today. My question is about the two works by Tang Wen Fan that are included in this show, and I think there may be one other contemporary artist as well. I wonder if you could speak to the thinking there and how you see that working in the show. Thank you.
I think that's also for me now. Yeah, we wanted to help the visitors kind of understand the fact that the show could still have kind of contemporary meanings and resonances. And so when I saw some of those works by Tang Wen Fan, I was struck by how she was still engaged with specifically the history that we were talking about. So one of the works which you see at different parts of the exhibition is called Magical Bows, Lacquered Time, and it makes reference to the generation of lacquerers who I mentioned, who came to Paris and were actually lacquering the propellers. And in fact, in one iteration, she's even shown that work alongside one of the World War I propellers that they lacquered, which is very interesting. But what was fascinating to me was that an artist was still deeply engaged with that history and felt that that particular story was kind of still a meaningful thing to put forward in her work. So I thought that was kind of helpful for the visitor to also see, to kind of connect today and this past. For Tang Wen Fan's work about Dim Fung Ti, that had another quite special function, because we were also a little bit worried, and Patrick's earlier question about the timeline of the exhibition, we didn't want to make it sound like World War II happened, the late 1940s happened, and nobody ever went to Paris again, because clearly that wasn't the case. And one of the artists who did go to Paris in this later period was Dim Fung Ti, And she was quite closely linked, I guess, stylistically at least, to the sort of later developments of the post-war Paris art world, and certainly the interest in abstraction and organic forms and these kinds of issues. But also, that work was an extraordinary opportunity to be able to have a window into the interiority and the kind of subjective experience of an Asian artist in Paris, because that particular work kind of layered archival materials relating to Diem Phuong Thi, including her own exhibition catalogue texts, some interviews with her associates and her friends, which kind of gave a much more complex picture of what an artist kind of felt like coming to Paris, but also the sort of very difficult situation she faced on the return. So I felt that that was a work that allowed us to kind of see into, through Teo Nguyen Phan's intervention, allowed us to kind of see into more of the interiority of that experience. So it's not a documentary, of course, it's, you know, Phan Thanh Nguyen's creative work, but I think the way that she's produced it is also to kind of comment on exactly those interesting issues of kind of the personal, subjective experience of the migrant artist and return. So that was the reason for those. Would you like to say something about the Shen Yuan work?
For this, maybe I respond to Patrick's early question about curatorial and art historical. We pick up the Shen Yuan's work maybe within 30 minutes. This is not based on the art historical, but more based on like intuitive, creative input to satisfy the demand, to have some contemporary insertion. Yeah, and sometimes that is a curatorial judgment. At that moment, all of us just decide, okay, that is the one, as the correct one to end the show. So that is really out of the art historical, you know, textbook. So maybe it's a bit diverse to what Phoebe say now, but I want to say that is the exciting part. And it's not text to text. The work, the image, and what you really feel on site, the brush strokes, the painterly effect, that is really excitement of the curatorial practice. And that is beyond the textbook of art historical. I mean, that's what I feel again, being lighter again, through putting up this show. Sorry, a bit diverse from the, yeah,
I
from
also
the,
feel
you
a
know,
certain
what
amount of excitement about our work.
Talk about the Shen Yuan, the work itself, right? Yeah, yeah.
I think on the point of excitement, we bring this panel to a close. Let me thank everyone who is here. We mean Phoebe, Lisa, Roy, and Cai Heng. So thank you.